Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, where we explore some of the most influential books that have shaped history and continue to inspire today. If you're here with Two Treatises of Government by John Locke, you're not just any reader. You're someone who chooses to invest in knowledge, in growth, and in understanding the foundations of our modern world. While others might be scrolling through social media or lost in the endless stream of video content, you've decided to delve into a book that has shaped the very fabric of democracy and individual rights. This choice says a lot about your pursuit of depth and understanding. Two Treatises of Government isn't just any book. It's a revolutionary work that laid the groundwork for modern political philosophy and influenced critical documents like the American Declaration of Independence. It's been acknowledged by figures like Thomas Jefferson, who drew heavily from Locke's ideas. John Locke, an English philosopher, wrote during a time of immense political turmoil, witnessing the Glorious Revolution, which undoubtedly shaped his worldview. His desire to assert the importance of individual rights and the social contract was a response to the absolutism and the divine right of kings of his time. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. A foundational text on governance and rights. John Locke was an influential English philosopher and physician, regarded as one of the most prominent Enlightenment thinkers. He lived through the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, witnessing firsthand the conflicts between monarchy and parliament. These experiences deeply influenced his thoughts on governance and personal liberty, leading him to write Two Treatises of Government to advocate for the social contract and the necessity of a government based on the consent of the governed. Picture this. It's 1689. And John Locke is sitting down to write what would become one of the most revolutionary political documents in human history. But here's the thing that might surprise you. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was trying to finish one. The Glorious Revolution had just swept through England, deposing King James II, and Locke found himself in the unique position of having to explain why overthrowing a king could actually be the right thing to do. It's a bit like being asked to write the instruction manual for something that's already been built, except in this case, that something was an entirely new way of thinking about government and power. Now imagine you're living in Locke's time. For centuries, people had been told that kings ruled by divine right, that God himself had appointed monarchs to govern, and questioning royal authority was essentially questioning God. It was the ultimate trump card. Kings didn't need to justify their actions because, well, they were God's chosen representatives on earth. But Locke looked around at the chaos, the arbitrary arrests, the religious persecution, and the economic turmoil, and he thought, wait a minute. If this is what divine rule looks like, maybe we need to reconsider the whole system. Think about this for a moment. How radical was it to suggest that maybe, just maybe, government should actually serve the people instead of the other way around? It's like suggesting that restaurants should cater to their customers' tastes rather than forcing customers to eat whatever the chef feels like making. Today, this seems obvious, but in Locke's time, it was borderline heretical. The Two Treatises of Government emerged from this intellectual rebellion, but Locke was clever about how he approached it. He didn't just tear down the old system. He methodically dismantled it piece by piece, then carefully constructed something new in its place. The First Treatise was essentially a demolition job, taking apart the arguments of Sir Robert Filmer, who had written extensively about the divine right of kings. But the Second Treatise, that's where the magic happens. That's where Locke builds his case for what we now recognize as modern democratic government. What makes Locke's approach so fascinating is that he starts with the most basic question imaginable. Why do we even need government at all? It's like asking why we need traffic lights when we could all just figure out intersections on our own. Locke imagined what he called the state of nature, a time before governments existed, when people lived freely and governed themselves. Now, you might think this would be chaos, but Locke had a more optimistic view of human nature than many of his contemporaries. He believed that even without government, people could generally get along, make agreements, and resolve disputes through reason. But here's where it gets interesting. Locke recognized that while the state of nature might work most of the time, there would inevitably be problems. What happens when someone steals your property? What happens when people can't agree on what's fair? What happens when someone is so powerful that they can simply take what they want? This is where government comes in, not as a master ruling over subjects, but as a kind of referee that people voluntarily agree to accept. Think about your neighborhood homeowners association, if you have one. Nobody forced you to live there, but by choosing to live in that community, you agreed to abide by certain rules and to accept the authority of the association to enforce those rules. If the association starts making unreasonable demands or acting against the interests of the community, you have options. You can vote them out. You can leave, or in extreme cases, you can dissolve the association entirely. Locke's vision of government works on a similar principle, just scaled up to the level of entire nations. This was revolutionary thinking, because it flipped the entire relationship between ruler and ruled upside down. Instead of people existing to serve the government, government exists to serve the people. Instead of power flowing down from God through the king to the subjects, power flows up from the people through their representatives to the government. It's like the difference between a traditional corporation, where the CEO makes all the decisions and everyone else follows orders, versus a worker-owned cooperative, where the employees collectively decide how to run the business. But Locke wasn't just theorizing in a vacuum. He was writing in response to very real political crises that were tearing England apart. The country had just lived through decades of civil war, the execution of one king, the restoration of another, and now the overthrow of yet another. People were exhausted by the instability and desperate for a form of government that could provide both order and liberty. Locke's genius was in showing that these weren't contradictory goals, that properly constructed government could actually enhance both stability and freedom. Consider how relevant this remains today. Every time there's a major political crisis, we find ourselves grappling with the same fundamental questions that Locke addressed. When should citizens obey their government, and when should they resist? What makes a law legitimate? How do we balance individual rights with collective needs? Whether we're talking about protests against police brutality, debates over pandemic restrictions, or arguments about immigration policy, we're essentially having the same conversation that Locke started over 3 centuries ago. What's particularly striking about Locke's approach is how practical and grounded it is. He wasn't interested in abstract philosophical arguments for their own sake. He was trying to solve real problems that real people faced in their daily lives. How do you protect property rights without creating a system so rigid that it prevents beneficial change? How do you ensure that those in power remain accountable to those they govern? How do you create institutions strong enough to maintain order, but not so strong that they become tyrannical? These questions feel remarkably contemporary because, in many ways, we're still working on the answers. The specific challenges may have evolved. Locke couldn't have imagined social media or global corporations or climate change. But the underlying tension between liberty and order, between individual rights and collective welfare, remains as relevant as ever. As we prepare to dive deeper into Locke's arguments, it's worth remembering that he wasn't just writing for political philosophers or policymakers. He was writing for ordinary people who wanted to understand why their government should serve them rather than the other way around. His ideas helped inspire the American Revolution, influence the writing of the Constitution, and continue to shape democratic movements around the world today. Not bad for a philosophical treatise written over coffee, and candlelight more than 3 centuries ago. Picture yourself settling into your favorite coffee shop chair, steam rising from your cup, as we dive into one of the most revolutionary political debates in human history. John Locke didn't just write a dry academic treatise when he penned his First Treatise of Government. He launched a full-scale intellectual assault on one of the most dangerous ideas of his time, that kings rule by divine right, handed down from God himself through an unbroken chain stretching back to Adam and Eve. Now, you might be wondering why a 17th-century English philosopher would spend hundreds of pages arguing with a dead man named Sir Robert Filmer. But here's the thing, Filmer's book Patriarcha wasn't just gathering dust on library shelves. It was the intellectual ammunition being used to justify absolute monarchy across Europe. Kings were literally pointing to Filmer's arguments and saying, "See, God made me your ruler. Question me, and you question God himself." Imagine if someone today wrote a best-selling book arguing that CEOs should have absolute power over their employees because, well, that's just the natural order of things. Fathers rule families, so father figures should rule everyone else. You'd probably want someone to write a pretty thorough response, right? That's exactly what Locke did, except the stakes were life and death, and the CEO in question could have you executed for disagreeing with him. Filmer's central argument was elegantly simple and utterly terrifying. He claimed that when God gave Adam dominion over the earth and all living things, he wasn't just talking about animals and plants, he meant people too. Adam became the first absolute monarch, and every legitimate ruler since then inherited this divine authority through an unbroken patriarchal line. Kings weren't accountable to their subjects any more than fathers were accountable to their children. The political and the personal were one and the same. Think about this for a moment. Under Filmer's logic, questioning your king wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. Resisting tyranny wasn't heroic. It was sinful rebellion against God's chosen representative on earth. This wasn't just political theory. This was a complete worldview that turned every act of resistance into a ticket to hell. Locke saw right through this intellectual sleight of hand. With the patience of a master craftsman dismantling a complex machine, he began taking apart Filmer's arguments piece by piece. First, he tackled the biblical interpretation. Even if we accept that Adam had some kind of dominion, Locke asked, where exactly in Scripture does it say this dominion was political? When God told Adam to subdue the earth, was he really establishing a government? Or was he simply giving humanity the right to use natural resources for survival? Here's where Locke's argument becomes brilliantly practical. He points out something that seems obvious once you think about it, but was revolutionary at the time. There's a huge difference between having authority over things and having authority over people. When a farmer plants crops, he's exercising dominion over the land, but that doesn't make him the political ruler of everyone who eats his grain. Authority and jurisdiction are completely different concepts, and Filmer had conveniently blurred the lines between them. But Locke wasn't finished. He pressed deeper into Filmer's genealogical claims with the kind of logical precision that must have made kings across Europe very uncomfortable. Even if Adam had been given political authority, which Locke disputed, how could anyone possibly trace their lineage back to prove they were the legitimate heir? Think about this practically. We're talking about thousands of years of human history, countless wars, migrations, intermarriages, and lost records. The idea that any monarch could definitively prove their divine lineage was not just improbable, it was absurd. Locke illustrated this with devastating clarity by pointing out the obvious. If political authority really descended through primogeniture from Adam, then at any given moment, there could only be one legitimate ruler on the entire planet. Every other king, emperor, or prince would be a usurper. This wasn't just inconvenient for Filmer's theory, it completely demolished it. After all, Filmer was trying to justify monarchy in general, not argue that only one specific person had the right to rule everyone on Earth. Now, here's where Locke's insights become startlingly relevant to our modern world. Replace divine right of kings with any contemporary claim to absolute authority, and you'll see the same logical problems. Whether it's a dictator claiming to represent the will of the people, a CEO arguing that shareholders' interests justify any action, or any leader insisting their authority is beyond question, the fundamental issue remains the same. When someone claims their power comes from a source that can't be questioned or verified, they're essentially asking you to accept tyranny dressed up in fancy clothes. Locke's demolition of Filmer's biblical arguments was particularly masterful. He showed that even the most patriarchal readings of Scripture didn't support absolute monarchy. Yes, fathers had authority over their children, but this authority was temporary, conditional, and limited. Children grew up and became independent. Fathers had responsibilities as well as rights. Most importantly, paternal authority was natural and personal, not political and transferable. Consider how radical this distinction was in Locke's time. He was essentially arguing that political authority and family authority were completely different categories. A king wasn't the father of his nation in any meaningful sense. He couldn't claim the natural affection, intimate knowledge, or biological connection that gave parents their legitimate authority. Political rulers were, at best, hired managers, not divinely appointed patriarchs. This insight resonates powerfully today when we see leaders trying to cultivate cult-like devotion by positioning themselves as father figures or saviors. Locke's analysis reminds us to ask hard questions. What exactly gives this person authority? Is their power accountable and limited, or absolute and unquestionable? Are they serving our interests, or demanding that we serve theirs? Perhaps most importantly, Locke demonstrated that Filmer's entire project was based on a category error. Political authority isn't like parental authority, divine authority, or property ownership. It's a unique type of relationship that requires its own justification and limitations. You can't simply borrow the logic from one sphere of life and apply it to politics without doing serious violence to both reason and human dignity. As we close this chapter of intellectual combat, we can see that Locke's first treatise was much more than an academic exercise. It was a systematic dismantling of the most sophisticated justification for tyranny that the Western world had yet produced. By showing that kings couldn't claim divine appointment through Adam's lineage, Locke opened the door to a revolutionary question. If political authority doesn't come from God through hereditary succession, where does it come from? That question would lead him to develop one of the most influential political theories in human history. But that's a story for our next conversation over coffee. Welcome back to One Book, One Coffee, where we dive deep into the ideas that shaped our world, one sip at a time. I hope you've got your favorite brew ready because today we're exploring one of the most revolutionary concepts in political philosophy, John Locke's vision of the state of nature and natural rights. And trust me, this isn't just dusty old theory from the 1600s. These ideas are living and breathing in every democratic society today, including the very freedoms you're exercising right now by choosing what to listen to. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning and all governments have simply vanished. No police, no courts, no presidents or prime ministers, no laws written in books. Just you and every other human being on Earth, completely free to do whatever you want. Sounds terrifying, right? Or maybe liberating. Well, John Locke looked at this exact scenario and came to a surprisingly optimistic conclusion that would forever change how we think about government, rights, and human nature itself. Now think about this for a moment. When philosophers before Locke imagined life without government, they usually painted a pretty grim picture. Thomas Hobbes famously described it as a war of all against all, where life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But Locke saw something entirely different. He envisioned what he called the state of nature, not as a hellscape of violence, but as a condition of perfect freedom and equality where people could live quite peacefully, governed by natural law and reason. But what exactly did Locke mean by this state of nature? Imagine you and a friend are hiking in a remote wilderness, miles from any city or town. You find a beautiful clearing with a stream running through it. Who owns this land? Who has the right to drink from the stream? Who can pick the berries growing on the bushes? In Locke's state of nature, you both have equal claim to these resources. You're both perfectly free to use what you need to survive and thrive, as long as you don't interfere with your friend's ability to do the same. This is where Locke's genius really shines through. He argued that even without government, we're not lawless creatures. We're governed by what he called the law of nature, which he believed was written into the very fabric of our being by God. This natural law tells us that since we're all equally created, we all have the same fundamental rights. And here's the kicker: these rights don't come from kings, governments, or constitutions. They come from our very existence as rational human beings. Think about the last time you felt genuinely outraged by an injustice. Maybe you saw someone being bullied, or heard about a person being denied opportunities because of their race or gender. That fire in your belly, that's what Locke would call your natural sense of justice kicking in. You didn't need a law book to tell you it was wrong, you just knew it deep down. That's the law of nature at work. Locke identified three fundamental natural rights that every person possesses: life, liberty, and property. Let's break these down in ways that make sense for our modern world. The right to life isn't just about not being murdered, it's about having the freedom to pursue your own path to happiness and fulfillment. When a government provides health care, protects the environment, or ensures food safety, it's really protecting your natural right to life. Liberty, the second right, goes far beyond just physical freedom. It's the right to make your own choices about how to live, what to believe, who to love, what career to pursue. Every time you swipe through Netflix deciding what to watch, every time you choose your political candidate, every time you decide to change jobs, you're exercising the natural liberty that Locke argued was yours by birthright, not by government permission. But it's the third right, property, where Locke really revolutionized thinking. Now, don't imagine him just talking about owning stuff. For Locke, property was much deeper than that. He argued that you own your own body, your own labor, and therefore anything you create through your work. When you mix your labor with something in nature, it becomes yours. Picture a farmer clearing a field and planting crops. That farmer has mixed their labor with the land, and according to Locke, they now have a property right in both the land and the harvest. This idea might seem obvious now, but it was radical in Locke's time when most people believed that kings owned everything by divine right. Locke was essentially saying that a peasant who worked the land had a better claim to it than a king who never set foot on it. Can you imagine how threatening this was to the established order? But here's where it gets really interesting for us today. Locke's theory of property helps us understand modern debates about intellectual property, digital rights, and even social media. When you create content for YouTube, write a blog post, or even post a clever tweet, you're mixing your mental labor with digital resources. In Locke's framework, you have a natural property right in that creation. This is why we get so upset when someone steals our content or uses our work without permission. We instinctively understand that they're violating our natural property rights. Now you might be thinking, this all sounds pretty idealistic. If the state of nature is so great, why do we need government at all? And that's exactly the question Locke grappled with. He acknowledged that even in the state of nature, problems arise. What happens when people disagree about their natural rights? What if someone takes more than they need, leaving others without enough? What if someone decides to ignore the law of nature altogether and starts stealing, hurting, or killing others? Locke's answer was beautifully practical. He said that in the state of nature, everyone has the right to enforce natural law. If someone steals from you, you have the right to punish them and demand compensation. If someone attacks your neighbor, you have the right to step in and defend them. We see this playing out today in everything from citizens' arrests to the basic human impulse to help someone in trouble. But here's the problem. When everyone is both judge and jury in their own case, things can get messy pretty quickly. You might think someone owes you $100 while they think they only owe 50. Without an impartial third party to settle the dispute, conflicts can escalate. This is why Locke argued that people would voluntarily choose to leave the state of nature and form governments, not because the state of nature is inherently bad, but because organized society can better protect our natural rights. This insight transforms how we think about the relationship between citizens and government. Government isn't our master, it's our employee. We hire government to do a job, protecting our natural rights more effectively than we could do ourselves. And just like any employee, if government fails to do its job or starts working against our interests, we have the right to fire it. As we wrap up this exploration of Locke's state of nature, consider how these ideas continue to shape our world today. Every time we debate the proper role of government, argue about individual rights versus collective needs, or question whether a law is just, we're really having a conversation that started with Locke's revolutionary insight, that our rights come from our humanity, not from human institutions. The next time you're enjoying the simple freedom to speak your mind, practice your religion, or pursue your dreams, remember that these aren't privileges granted by benevolent rulers. According to Locke, they're your natural inheritance as a rational human being, as fundamental to your existence as breathing itself. And that, my friend, is a truth worth savoring over whatever remains in your coffee cup. You know, there's something deeply unsettling about the way power justifies itself, isn't there? We've been exploring how John Locke dismantled the divine right of kings, but now we need to tackle an even darker question that was haunting his era and, frankly, still haunts ours today. Picture this. You're sitting in a coffee shop in 1689, and someone walks in claiming they own another human being because they conquered them in war. Sounds barbaric, right? Yet this was exactly the kind of reasoning that powerful people were using to justify some of humanity's greatest horrors. Locke turns his philosophical spotlight on two of the most morally charged concepts of his time, conquest and slavery. And here's what makes this so fascinating. He's not just having an abstract debate. He's writing during an era when European powers are colonizing the Americas, when the slave trade is reaching horrific new heights, and when might makes right thinking is being dressed up in fancy philosophical clothes. Think of Locke as that friend who refuses to let you get away with a bad excuse. Someone says, "I own this land because I conquered it," and Locke responds, "Hold on there. Let's think about what conquest actually means." Now think about this for a moment. When we hear the word conquest today, what comes to mind? Maybe Alexander the Great sweeping across Asia, or European explorers planting flags on foreign shores, or even something as modern as a corporate takeover. But Locke forces us to ask a fundamental question. Does winning a fight actually give you legitimate authority over the loser? It's like asking whether beating someone at chess gives you the right to redecorate their house. Locke draws a crucial distinction that most people of his era conveniently ignored. There's a massive difference between a just war and an unjust one. Imagine someone breaks into your home, threatens your family, and you defend yourself. If you manage to subdue the attacker, you might have certain rights over them, perhaps to seek compensation or ensure they face justice. But here's the key. Your authority comes from their wrongdoing, not from your superior strength. It's like the difference between a police officer arresting a criminal and a bully taking someone's lunch money. The action might look similar, but the moral foundation is completely different. But what about when the aggressor wins? This is where Locke's analysis becomes truly powerful. He argues that an unjust conqueror, someone who attacks without cause, gains absolutely no legitimate authority, no matter how decisive their victory. Think about this in modern terms. If a stronger nation invades a weaker one purely for resources or territory, does their military success somehow transform their aggression into legitimate government? Locke's answer is a resounding no. It's like saying that because a bank robber successfully empties the vault, they're now the rightful owner of the money. Here's where things get really interesting, though. Locke acknowledges that even in a just war, Conquest has strict limits. Let's say you're defending your community against raiders, and you manage to defeat them. According to Locke, you might have claims against the attackers themselves, but you certainly don't gain authority over their innocent family members or their entire society. It's as if winning a lawsuit against someone doesn't give you the right to boss around their children and grandchildren for generations to come. This principle becomes explosive when applied to slavery. Remember, Locke is writing in an era when slavery is being justified through various twisted arguments. Some claim that Africans were naturally inferior, others that they were prisoners of just wars, still others that slavery was actually beneficial to the enslaved. Locke systematically demolishes these justifications with the precision of a master craftsman dismantling a poorly built house. His argument about slavery is both simple and revolutionary. No one can voluntarily enslave themselves because no one has the power to give away their own life. Think about this carefully. Locke argues that our lives belong to God, not to ourselves, so we can't sell or surrender what isn't truly ours to begin with. It's like trying to sell your neighbor's car. You simply don't have the authority to make that transaction, regardless of how willing the buyer might be. But what about prisoners of war? Surely someone who attacks you and loses has forfeited their rights. Here's where Locke's thinking becomes beautifully nuanced. He agrees that an unjust aggressor might forfeit their right to life, but here's the crucial point. Forfeiting your right to life doesn't mean someone else gains unlimited power over you. The victor can choose not to kill you, but that act of mercy doesn't transform you into property. It's the difference between a judge suspending a death sentence and a master owning a slave. Consider how this applies to the colonial context of Locke's era. European powers were claiming vast territories and enslaving entire populations, often justifying these actions as the fruits of conquest. Locke's analysis cuts through these justifications like a hot knife through butter. Even if we accepted that Europeans were engaged in just wars, which is highly questionable, their victories would give them no authority over non-combatants, no right to permanent dominion, and certainly no justification for treating human beings as property. Now, you might be wondering how this connects to our modern world. Think about contemporary situations where might tries to disguise itself as right. When authoritarian regimes claim legitimacy through force, when economic power translates into political control, when historical injustices are defended because that's just how things were back then. Locke's framework gives us tools to cut through these justifications and ask the fundamental question: where does legitimate authority actually come from? The practical wisdom here extends far beyond political philosophy. In our personal relationships, in our workplaces, in our communities, we constantly encounter situations where someone claims authority based on superior strength, wealth, or position. Locke reminds us to ask, is this authority legitimate, or is it just conquest dressed up in respectable clothes? What makes Locke's analysis so enduringly powerful is how he refuses to let practical considerations override moral principles. Yes, conquest happens. Yes, the strong often dominate the weak, but acknowledging reality doesn't mean accepting it as morally justified. It's like recognizing that diseases exist without concluding that sickness is healthy. As we move forward in our exploration of Locke's revolutionary ideas, we'll see how his rejection of conquest-based authority leads him toward a radically different vision of legitimate government. If authority can't come from divine appointment, inherited status, or superior force, where can it come from? The answer will reshape our understanding of political power itself, but that's a conversation for our next cup of coffee together. Picture yourself sitting in your favorite coffee shop, maybe glancing around at all the personal belongings scattered on tables, laptops, phones, that half-finished latte that definitely belongs to someone. Now, here's a question that might seem obvious at first. Why do we all just accept that these things belong to specific people? What makes something truly yours? John Locke, writing in the late 1600s, wrestled with this exact question, and his answer would go on to shape everything from the American Revolution to modern debates about intellectual property, and even your right to that parking spot you've been circling the block to find. When Locke sat down to think about property rights, he wasn't starting from scratch in some philosophical vacuum. He was living through a time when the very foundations of political authority were being questioned. Kings claimed divine right to rule, but Locke was asking much more fundamental questions. If we start with the assumption that the earth and everything in it was given to humanity in common, how did we end up with a world where some people own vast estates while others own nothing at all? And more importantly, is this arrangement legitimate, or is it just might making right? Locke's answer begins with something beautifully simple and yet profound. You own yourself. Think about this for a moment. It seems almost too obvious to state, but it's actually revolutionary. In Locke's time, many believed that kings owned their subjects, that people were essentially property of the state. But Locke argued that each person has an undeniable property right in their own person. Nobody else can rightfully claim ownership over your body, your thoughts, your decisions. This self-ownership becomes the foundation stone for everything else. But here's where it gets really interesting. If you own yourself, then you also own your labor, the work your hands do, the effort your mind produces, the sweat of your brow. And when you mix your labor with something from the common store of nature, something magical happens in Locke's framework. You make it yours. Imagine you're walking through an untamed forest and you spend hours gathering wild apples. Those apples, which belong to no one in particular, become yours through the simple act of your labor. You picked them, you invested your time and effort, and that investment creates a property right. Now you might be thinking, that seems almost too simple. Can it really be that straightforward? And you'd be right to wonder. Locke himself recognized that this labor theory of property needed some important limitations. You can't just claim ownership of vast swaths of unused land by barely touching them. There has to be enough left for others, what philosophers call the enough and as good provision. And you can't waste what you've claimed. If you pick those apples only to let them rot, you've violated the natural law that governs property rights. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. When a musician writes a song, they're mixing their mental labor with the common heritage of musical notes and language to create something new. When a programmer writes code, they're taking the shared knowledge of computer science and adding their own creative effort. Even when you customize your smartphone with your photos and apps, you're in a sense mixing your labor with a mass-produced object to make it distinctly yours. But Locke's insights go much deeper than individual ownership. He recognized that property rights are absolutely essential for civil society to function. Without secure property rights, why would anyone invest the time and effort to improve anything? If you spend months cultivating a garden only to have someone else claim the harvest, you'll probably think twice before planting again next season. Property rights create what economists today call incentives. They give people reasons to be productive, to innovate, to take care of resources rather than squander them. This is where Locke's thinking becomes politically explosive. If property rights exist before government, if they arise naturally from human labor and need, then government's job isn't to grant property rights but to protect them. The state doesn't create your right to own things. It exists to safeguard rights you already possess. This completely flips the traditional relationship between ruler and ruled. Instead of subjects who depend on royal favor for their possessions, we become citizens whose property rights constrain what government can legitimately do. Think about how radical this was in Locke's era, and how radical it remains today. When a government can simply seize private property without compensation, or when bureaucrats can arbitrarily decide which businesses can operate and which cannot, they're violating the fundamental principle that property rights precede political authority. This doesn't mean property rights are absolute. Even Locke recognized they could be limited for genuine public necessity. But it does mean that such limitations require serious justification, not mere governmental convenience. The beauty of Locke's framework is how it connects individual freedom with social prosperity. When people can securely own the fruits of their labor, they have powerful incentives to work hard, save for the future, and invest in improvements. A farmer who owns his land will fertilize it and repair his fences. A renter might not bother. An entrepreneur who can patent her invention will invest years developing it. Without intellectual property protection, she might keep her innovations secret or not pursue them at all. But perhaps most importantly, Locke understood that property rights are intimately connected to human dignity and independence. When you own things, whether it's a small apartment, a savings account, or even just your personal possessions, you have a foundation for independence that makes genuine freedom possible. You're not entirely dependent on others' goodwill or government benefits. You have something that's yours, something that gives you standing to participate in society as an equal rather than a supplicant. This insight resonates powerfully today as we grapple with questions about wealth inequality and economic opportunity. While Locke's framework doesn't solve all these problems, it reminds us that the goal should be expanding property ownership, not abandoning the institution altogether. When more people have genuine stakes in society through property ownership, democracy becomes more stable and prosperity more widely shared. As we move forward in our exploration of Locke's political philosophy, keep this foundation in mind. Property rights aren't just about stuff, they're about human dignity, social cooperation, and the proper relationship between individuals and their government. They're the economic expression of the deeper principle that each person has inherent worth and natural rights that no authority can legitimately violate. Understanding this connection will be crucial as we examine how Locke believed legitimate government should operate and what happens when it fails to protect the rights it exists to serve. Picture this. You're sitting around a campfire with a group of strangers after a shipwreck, and someone needs to decide who gets the last can of beans. How do you figure that out without ending up in a fistfight? Well, my friend, you've just stumbled into one of humanity's oldest puzzles, and John Locke had some pretty brilliant thoughts about it back in the 1680s. As we settle into this conversation about civil government and the social contract, imagine we're exploring how a bunch of individuals living in what Locke called the state of nature decided to create something we now take completely for granted: legitimate government. Now think about this for a moment. Why do you stop at red lights when there's no cop around? Why do you pay taxes instead of just keeping all your money? Why do we have presidents and prime ministers instead of just letting the strongest person boss everyone else around? Locke would say it's because, somewhere along the line, we all made a deal. Not literally, of course, but collectively, as human beings, we figured out that giving up some of our natural freedom was actually the smart move. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like before government according to Locke. Imagine you're living in this state of nature, and it's not the violent, nasty place that Thomas Hobbes described. Locke actually thought people were generally decent to each other. You have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. You can work the land, build a house, raise a family. Sounds pretty good, right? But here's the catch. What happens when your neighbor decides your apple tree is actually on his property? What if someone steals your horse? What if a group of bandits shows up and decides they want everything you've worked for? In Locke's state of nature, you have the right to defend yourself and your property. You can even punish people who wrong you. But think about how messy this gets. You're the judge, jury, and executioner in your own case. Your neighbor thinks you're being unfair. You think he's being unreasonable, and pretty soon you're spending more time fighting than farming. It's like trying to referee your own basketball game while you're playing in it. Sure, you might be completely fair and objective, but good luck convincing the other team of that. This is where Locke's genius really shines through. He realized that rational people would eventually say, "You know what? This isn't working. We need a better system." And that's where the social contract comes in. It's not a literal contract that your great-great-great-grandfather signed. It's more like an ongoing agreement that we all participate in because it makes our lives better. Here's how Locke imagined it working. A group of people living in the state of nature would get together and say, "Look, we're all reasonable folks here. Instead of everyone being their own judge and police officer, why don't we create a government? We'll give up our right to punish wrongdoers ourselves, and in exchange, we'll have impartial judges, consistent laws, and reliable enforcement." It's like agreeing to let a neutral referee call the game instead of having players make all the calls themselves. But here's the crucial part, and this is what made Locke's ideas so revolutionary. This government only has power because the people consent to it. Think about that for a second. The government doesn't get its authority from God or from conquest or because some king says so. It gets its power from the people it governs. It's like hiring a security company to protect your neighborhood. They work for you, not the other way around. This might seem obvious to us now, but in Locke's time this was radical stuff. Kings claimed they ruled by divine right, that God had appointed them to rule over their subjects. Locke was essentially saying, "Nope, sorry, Your Majesty. You work for us, and if you're not doing your job, we can fire you." Imagine how that went over with the royal crowd. Let's think about what this means in practice. When you vote in an election, you're participating in this social contract. You're saying, "I consent to be governed by whoever wins this fair election." When you follow laws, pay taxes, or serve on a jury, you're upholding your end of the bargain. And when politicians swear to uphold the Constitution and serve the public interest, they're acknowledging that their power comes from your consent. But Locke wasn't naive about this. He understood that governments could become corrupt, that they might start serving their own interests instead of the people's interests. What happens then? Well, this is where his theory gets really interesting. If a government violates the terms of the social contract, if it stops protecting people's natural rights and starts trampling on them instead, then the people have the right to withdraw their consent. They can dissolve that government and create a new one. This idea of withdrawing consent is like firing that security company I mentioned earlier. If they stop protecting your neighborhood and start robbing houses themselves, you're not obligated to keep paying them. In fact, you'd be crazy to keep them around. The same logic applies to government. This principle influenced the American colonists when they declared independence from Britain, and it continues to inspire democratic movements around the world today. Now think about how this plays out in modern democracies. Every few years, we have elections where we essentially renew or revoke our consent to be governed by particular leaders. It's like a periodic performance review for our government employees. Are they doing their job? Are they protecting our rights? Are they serving the public interest? If not, we can choose new representatives. But consent isn't just about voting. It's also about civil disobedience when laws are unjust, about peaceful protest when government overreaches, about staying engaged in civic life instead of just complaining from the sidelines. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat, she was exercising a form of withdrawal of consent from unjust laws. When people march for civil rights or against corruption, they're reminding government that its power depends on their ongoing agreement to be governed. The beauty of Locke's social contract theory is that it makes government both powerful and accountable. Government gets enough authority to maintain order, protect rights, and provide public goods, but it never forgets that this authority is on loan from the people. It's a partnership, not a dictatorship. The government provides security and justice, while the people provide legitimacy and cooperation. As we move forward in our exploration of Locke's political philosophy, keep this foundational idea in mind. Legitimate government exists only with the consent of the governed. It's a simple concept that has transformed the world, turning subjects into citizens and rulers into public servants. In our next conversation, we'll explore what happens when governments forget this basic truth, and how Locke's ideas about revolution and resistance continue to shape our understanding of political legitimacy today. Picture this. You're at a family dinner, and your dad tells you to pass the salt. Then imagine your boss at work asking you to finish a report. Now think about a dictator commanding citizens to surrender their property. Three different people giving you orders, but something feels fundamentally different about each situation, doesn't it? John Locke, writing over 3 centuries ago, was fascinated by exactly this puzzle. Why do we respond so differently to various forms of authority? And what makes some power legitimate while other forms feel oppressive or even tyrannical? In this brilliant section of his second treatise, Locke does something revolutionary for his time. He takes what most people lump together as simply power and carefully dissects it like a master surgeon, revealing 3 distinct types that operate by completely different rules. He calls them paternal power, political power, and despotical power. Now, you might be thinking, why does this matter to me in the 21st century? Well, grab your coffee a little tighter, because understanding these distinctions might just change how you see every relationship and institution around you. Let's start with paternal power, because this is probably the most familiar to all of us. Think about the relationship between parents and children. When your mother told you not to touch the hot stove, she wasn't asking for your vote or seeking your consent. She had authority over you, but it was a very specific kind of authority. Locke argues that parental power exists for one primary purpose: to guide and protect children until they develop the capacity to reason and make decisions for themselves. It's temporary, protective, and ultimately aimed at making itself unnecessary. Now here's where Locke gets really interesting. He insists that this parental authority has absolutely nothing to do with political power, even though kings and rulers of his day constantly tried to justify their absolute rule by comparing themselves to fathers of their nations. Locke essentially says, hold on just a minute. A father's power over his 5-year-old daughter exists because she cannot yet reason properly about complex consequences. But what happens when that daughter turns 25? Does the father still have the right to control her property, dictate her marriage, or decide where she lives? Of course not. The power was never about the parent's benefit, it was about the child's development and protection. This insight hits differently when you think about modern helicopter parenting, doesn't it? Locke would probably look at parents still making major life decisions for their adult children and ask some uncomfortable questions. Is this really protective authority, or has it transformed into something else entirely? The key test Locke offers is simple. Is this power being exercised for the benefit of the person being governed, and does it have a natural endpoint when that person can govern themselves? Now let's shift to political power, which Locke argues is something completely different. Political power emerges when free, rational adults come together and agree to create a government for their mutual benefit. Think about it this way. Imagine you and your neighbors decide to pool resources to hire a security guard for your street. You're not giving that guard the authority of a parent over children, and you're certainly not surrendering yourself as a slave. You're creating a specific, limited arrangement where you grant certain powers in exchange for certain services. This is the heart of Locke's revolutionary idea about political authority. Unlike parental power, which is natural and temporary, political power is artificial and consensual. It exists only because people agree to it, and it exists only for the purposes they agree to. When your elected representatives pass laws about traffic safety, they're exercising political power that you and your fellow citizens have collectively granted them. But notice something crucial. This power has strict boundaries. They can't decide what you have for breakfast or whom you marry, because you never consented to give them authority over those areas of your life. Here's where things get fascinating in our modern context. Think about the ongoing debates over government surveillance, vaccine mandates, or social media regulation. Locke's framework gives us a powerful lens for analyzing these controversies. The question isn't whether the government has power, but whether they have the specific type of power being exercised, and whether that power stays within the boundaries of what people actually consented to when they formed the political community. But then Locke introduces the darkest form of authority, despotical power. This is the power of a master over a slave, or more broadly, the power that exists when someone has forfeited their rights through their own actions. Now, before you start feeling uncomfortable, remember that Locke is writing in a time when slavery was unfortunately common, and he's actually trying to severely limit when such absolute power could ever be justified. Locke argues that despotical power can only exist in very specific circumstances, essentially when someone has put themselves in a state of war against others. Think of it this way. If someone breaks into your house with the intent to harm your family, they have, in that moment, forfeited their right to be treated as a member of the political community. They've chosen to operate outside the bounds of consensual political power, and you have the right to use whatever force is necessary to protect yourself. This concept becomes incredibly relevant when we think about criminal justice today. When society imprisons someone for a violent crime, we're exercising a form of despotical power, but Locke would insist it's only justified because that person chose to violate the fundamental terms of living in a political community. Even then, this power should be limited, temporary when possible, and never exercised arbitrarily. What makes Locke's analysis so powerful is how it reveals the confusion and manipulation that happens when these different types of power get mixed up. Throughout history, tyrants have justified their absolute rule by claiming paternal authority. I'm like a father to my people. But Locke exposes this as nonsense. Adult citizens aren't children who need a political father to make their decisions for them. Similarly, when politicians claim unlimited emergency powers, we can ask, is this really the political power we consented to, or has it morphed into something despotical? Consider how these distinctions play out in your daily life. Your relationship with your employer involves consensual arrangements with specific boundaries. Your relationship with your adult children should be based on mutual respect, not ongoing parental authority. Your relationship with your government should involve clearly defined powers that you've collectively agreed to grant. When any of these relationships step outside their proper boundaries, you can feel it immediately, even if you couldn't previously articulate why. Locke's insights remind us that power isn't just power. The source, purpose, and limits of authority matter enormously. As we navigate an increasingly complex world of institutions, relationships, and governance structures, understanding these distinctions becomes not just intellectually interesting, but practically essential for maintaining our freedom and dignity as rational human beings. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, steam rising from your mug, and your friend across the table just asked you the most fundamental question about modern life. Why do we even need government? You might laugh it off at first, but John Locke would lean forward with that knowing smile and say, now that's exactly the right question to ask. And honestly, after spending centuries thinking about this very problem, he's got some pretty compelling answers that might just change how you see every news headline, every election, and every time you interact with any form of authority. Let's dive into what Locke calls the ends of political society and government, which sounds fancy but really just means, what's the whole point of having governments in the first place? And here's where it gets fascinating, because Locke's answer isn't what you might expect. He doesn't say governments exist to tell us what to do, or to make us moral, or even to make us happy. Instead, he makes this brilliant observation that governments exist for one primary reason: to protect something we already have. Think about this for a moment. Before there were kings or presidents or city councils, Locke argues, people already possessed what he calls natural rights. These aren't rights that some authority figure graciously grants you, like a boss giving you vacation days. These are rights you have simply by being human, by existing in the world. The big three that Locke focuses on are life, liberty, and property. And when you really think about it, these cover just about everything that matters to human flourishing. Now, imagine you're living in what Locke calls the state of nature, basically a world without organized government. You wake up in the morning, you're free to make your own choices. You can work to improve your situation. You can build something with your own hands and call it yours. Sounds pretty good, right? But here's the catch that Locke brilliantly identifies. What happens when someone else decides they want what you've built? What happens when someone stronger decides your rights don't matter as much as their desires? This is where Locke tells us a story that feels remarkably modern. In the state of nature, everyone is supposed to respect everyone else's natural rights. It's like an honor system on a cosmic scale. But we all know how honor systems work out in practice, don't we? There's always that one person who takes the last donut even though they already had 3. Except in the state of nature, instead of donuts, we're talking about your house, your safety, maybe even your life. The problem isn't that natural rights don't exist without government, Locke insists. The problem is that without some kind of organized system, these rights become what he calls very uncertain and constantly exposed to the invasion of others. Picture trying to enjoy a peaceful picnic while constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering if someone's going to come steal your sandwich or worse. That's not really freedom, is it? That's anxiety with a side of paranoia. So here's where Locke's genius really shines through. He argues that rational people, understanding this dilemma, would voluntarily come together and create something we call government. But notice what's happening here. They're not giving up their natural rights to some all-powerful authority. They're not trading freedom for security in some kind of devil's bargain. Instead, they're creating an institution whose entire job is to better protect the rights they already possess. Think of it like this. Imagine you and your neighbors all have valuable things in your homes, but there's no police force, no courts, no organized way to deal with thieves or settle disputes. You might all get together and hire a security company, create some rules about what constitutes theft, and establish a fair way to resolve conflicts. You're not giving the security company permission to take your stuff. You're paying them to protect your stuff more effectively than you could on your own. This is revolutionary thinking, and it's worth pausing to appreciate just how radical this was in Locke's time. For most of human history, the prevailing view was that rulers had some kind of divine right to govern, that they possessed authority simply because God or nature or superior force put them in charge. Locke flips this completely upside down. In his view, legitimate government authority comes from the consent of the governed, and it exists solely to serve the people's pre-existing rights. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Locke argues that this arrangement only works if everyone involved understands the deal. The government gets specific, limited powers to protect natural rights, but it doesn't get to become the new threat to those same rights. It's like hiring a bodyguard who then decides they own your house. That's not protection. That's a different kind of tyranny. Now you might be wondering, how does this play out in the real world? Look around at any modern democracy, and you'll see Locke's fingerprints everywhere. When we talk about constitutional limits on government power, that's Locke. When we insist that authorities need warrants to search our homes, that's Locke protecting our natural rights. When we demand due process in courts, when we expect our representatives to actually represent us rather than just do whatever they want, when we argue that taxation without representation is tyranny, we're channeling Locke's insights about the proper ends of government. But Locke also gives us a framework for recognizing when government has lost its way. If the very institution we created to protect our natural rights starts systematically violating those rights, then it has failed in its fundamental purpose. It's like a fire department that goes around starting fires instead of putting them out. At that point, Locke suggests, the people have not just the right, but perhaps even the obligation to withdraw their consent and create something better. This isn't just historical theory, either. Every time citizens peacefully organize to change unjust laws, every time people demand accountability from their leaders, every time a society decides that certain government actions are unacceptable, they're applying Locke's principles about the ends of government. The civil rights movement, the push for women's suffrage, even modern debates about privacy rights in the digital age, all flow from this fundamental insight that government exists to serve us, not the other way around. As we finish our coffee and this conversation, here's what stays with me about Locke's vision. It's simultaneously humble and empowering. Humble because it acknowledges that we need institutions beyond ourselves to flourish. Empowering because it insists that we never surrender our fundamental dignity to those institutions. Government, in Locke's view, is a tool, not a master. And like any tool, its value lies entirely in how well it serves its intended purpose. The next time you interact with any form of government, from your local DMV to federal agencies, you might find yourself asking Locke's essential question. Is this institution serving its proper end of protecting natural rights, or has it forgotten why it exists in the first place? It's a question that never goes out of style, and one that every generation needs to answer for itself. Welcome back to One Book, One Coffee, where we're continuing our journey through John Locke's revolutionary ideas about government and power. Pour yourself another cup, because we're about to dive into one of the most explosive chapters in political philosophy: when and how a government can actually be dissolved by the people themselves. Now, imagine you're in a relationship that's gone completely toxic. Your partner has broken every promise, violated your trust, and is actively harming you. At what point do you say enough is enough and walk away? Locke is asking the same question about our relationship with government, and his answer might surprise you with how relevant it feels today, centuries after he wrote it. Think about this for a moment. We've all been taught that governments are these permanent, almost sacred institutions that we must respect and obey. But Locke flips this entire notion on its head. He argues that governments exist only because we, the people, agree to let them exist. And just like any contract or agreement, if one party breaks the terms, the whole deal can be called off. So when exactly can a government be dissolved? Locke gives us several scenarios, and they read like a checklist of political nightmares that feel remarkably contemporary. First, he says a government dissolves itself when those in power act contrary to their trust. Picture a babysitter you've hired to watch your children who instead throws a wild party, raids your refrigerator, and lets strangers into your house. You wouldn't hesitate to fire them, would you? The same principle applies to governments that betray the public trust. But here's where it gets really interesting. Locke distinguishes between the dissolution of government and the dissolution of society itself. Think of society as the foundation of a house, and government as the structure built on top. You can tear down a poorly built house and construct a better one without destroying the foundation. This is crucial because it means revolution doesn't have to mean chaos. The people, the community, the social bonds, all of that remains intact while the political structure gets rebuilt. Now, consider what happens when a government starts acting like a protection racket instead of a protector. Locke argues that when those in power use their authority to harm the very people they're supposed to serve, they've essentially declared war on their own citizens. It's like a security guard who starts robbing the store they're paid to protect. At that point, the social contract is void, and the people have every right to defend themselves and establish new leadership. One of Locke's most powerful insights is about the difference between resistance and rebellion. When people rise up against a tyrannical government, who's really the rebel? Is it the citizens demanding their rights, or is it the government officials who have abandoned their duties and broken their oaths? Locke argues brilliantly that it's actually the corrupt officials who are the true rebels. They're the ones rebelling against the proper order of things, against the trust placed in them, against the very purpose of government itself. Think about modern examples of this principle in action. When people protest against police brutality, who's really disturbing the peace? The citizens demanding accountability, or the officers who violated their oath to serve and protect? When whistleblowers expose government corruption, who's really being disloyal to their country? The person revealing the truth, or the officials who betrayed the public trust in the first place? But Locke isn't advocating for chaos or encouraging people to overthrow governments on a whim. He's remarkably thoughtful about this. He acknowledges that people are generally patient and slow to anger. They'll endure quite a bit of poor governance before they reach their breaking point. It's only when abuse becomes systematic, when it's clear that those in power are working against the public good rather than for it, that dissolution becomes justified. Here's another fascinating aspect of Locke's argument. He talks about how governments can dissolve themselves through their own actions, without any external force. When legislators act contrary to the trust placed in them, when they try to grab power that was never given to them, when they put their own interests above the common good, they're essentially committing political suicide. It's like a company CEO who embezzles funds and runs the business into the ground. At some point, the board of directors has no choice but to step in and make changes. Locke also addresses a question that might be nagging at you right now. Doesn't this create a recipe for constant instability? If people can just dissolve governments whenever they're unhappy, won't society fall apart? His answer is both practical and profound. First, he points out that people are naturally conservative about political change. They don't lightly throw away established institutions. Second, the threat of dissolution actually makes governments more accountable and responsive. It's like having a performance review at work. Knowing you can be fired tends to make you do your job better. The beauty of Locke's framework is that it provides a philosophical foundation for what we now call democracy and constitutional government. The idea that power flows from the people upward, rather than from kings or dictators downward, was revolutionary in his time and remains the bedrock of free societies today. When we vote officials out of office, when we demand transparency, when we insist on checks and balances, we're exercising the principles Locke laid out. But perhaps most importantly, Locke reminds us that we have both the right and the responsibility to remain vigilant about our government's actions. We're not passive subjects to be ruled over, but active participants in our own governance. The power to dissolve government is the ultimate check on tyranny, the final safeguard of our liberty. As we wrap up this exploration of governmental dissolution, remember that Locke isn't just giving us abstract theory. He's providing a practical guide for maintaining freedom. His ideas influenced the American Revolution, inspired democratic movements around the world, and continue to resonate today whenever people stand up to authoritarian overreach. The next time you see citizens demanding accountability from their leaders, you'll recognize the echoes of Locke's revolutionary insight that governments serve at the pleasure of the people, not the other way around. In our next segment, we'll explore how these ideas about dissolution connect to Locke's broader vision of legitimate government and the consent of the governed. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember that your voice in democracy matters more than you might realize. So we've been talking about how governments get their power from the people's consent, and what happens when rulers overstep their bounds. But here's where Locke gets really radical for his time, and honestly, it's still pretty revolutionary today. Picture this. You're sitting in a coffee shop in 1689, and someone starts telling you that ordinary people have the right to overthrow their government. You'd probably spit out your coffee, right? That's exactly what Locke was proposing, and it's one of the most dangerous and beautiful ideas in political philosophy. Now, think about this for a moment. What happens when the very people who are supposed to protect your rights become the ones violating them? Locke had lived through some pretty turbulent times in England, watching kings claim they ruled by divine right while trampling on their subjects' basic freedoms. He'd seen the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. These weren't abstract philosophical problems for him. They were lived realities that demanded answers. Locke's argument for rebellion starts with a simple but profound observation. Government exists to protect our natural rights to life, liberty, and property. When government consistently fails to do this, or worse, when it actively violates these rights, It breaks the social contract. And here's the kicker: when that contract is broken, the people have not just the option but sometimes the obligation to dissolve that government and create a new one. But wait, you might be thinking, doesn't this just lead to chaos? Won't people rebel over every little grievance? Locke was way ahead of you on this concern. He understood that rebellion is serious business, not something you do because your taxes went up a few percent or because you don't like a particular policy. He talks about this beautifully, noting that people are naturally conservative when it comes to their government. They'll put up with quite a lot before they'll risk the uncertainty and violence that comes with revolution. Think about it like this. Imagine you're in a bad relationship. You don't immediately pack your bags the first time your partner disappoints you. You try to work things out, you communicate, you give second chances. But if the relationship becomes consistently abusive, if your partner repeatedly violates your trust and threatens your well-being, eventually you reach a breaking point where staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. That's essentially Locke's view of the relationship between people and their government. The key word here is consistently. Locke isn't talking about isolated incidents or temporary hardships. He's describing what he calls a long train of abuses that demonstrates a clear pattern of tyranny. Sound familiar? If you've ever read the Declaration of Independence, you're hearing echoes of Locke's thinking. Jefferson and the other founders didn't just list their grievances against King George randomly. They were following Locke's blueprint for justifying rebellion. But here's where it gets really interesting. Locke argues that the right to rebellion isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting the very idea of legitimate government. When a ruler becomes a tyrant, they're not just harming their current subjects. They're undermining the whole concept that government should serve the people rather than the other way around. In Locke's view, tolerating tyranny doesn't preserve order. It destroys the foundation of true political order. Now, let's talk about what rebellion actually looks like in Locke's framework. He's not advocating for angry mobs storming palaces, though sometimes that might be what happens. The right to rebellion is really about the right of the people to withdraw their consent from a government that has violated the social contract. Sometimes this might mean peaceful resistance, like the American colonists' boycotts of British goods. Sometimes it might mean establishing alternative institutions, like the Continental Congress. And yes, sometimes it might mean armed resistance, though Locke sees this as a last resort. One of the most powerful aspects of Locke's argument is how he flips the traditional understanding of who's really causing disorder. The conventional wisdom of his time, and frankly of most times, is that rebels are the source of chaos and instability. But Locke argues that it's actually the tyrant who creates disorder by violating the natural order of legitimate government. When a ruler breaks the social contract, they're the ones introducing chaos into the system. The people who resist are actually trying to restore proper order. Consider how this plays out in modern contexts. Think about the civil rights movement in America. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, or when students sat in at segregated lunch counters, they were breaking the law. But from a Lockean perspective, they were actually upholding a higher law, the natural law that says all people deserve equal treatment. The disorder wasn't caused by the protesters. It was caused by a system that violated basic human dignity. Or look at the peaceful revolutions that swept Eastern Europe in 1989. When people in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany rose up against communist governments, they weren't creating chaos. They were responding to systems that had fundamentally violated the social contract by denying basic freedoms and opportunities for decades. But here's a crucial point that Locke emphasizes. The right to rebellion belongs to the people collectively, not to individuals acting on their own. This isn't about vigilante justice or personal vendettas. It's about the community as a whole recognizing that their government has become illegitimate and acting together to change it. This collective aspect is what separates legitimate resistance from mere lawlessness. Locke also grapples with the practical question of who gets to decide when rebellion is justified. His answer is both simple and profound. The people themselves. Not philosophers, not religious leaders, not foreign powers, but the actual people living under the government in question. They're the ones who experience the effects of their government's actions, and they're the ones who must live with the consequences of both tolerating tyranny and resisting it. This brings us to one of the most relevant aspects of Locke's thinking for our modern world. In an age of global communication and international institutions, we often see outside observers trying to judge whether resistance movements in other countries are legitimate. But Locke's framework suggests we should be very careful about such judgments. The people of a nation are the ultimate arbiters of whether their government has violated the social contract. As we wrap up this exploration of Locke's thoughts on rebellion, it's worth reflecting on how radical and yet how reasonable his ideas remain. The notion that government power comes from the people, that rulers are accountable to those they govern, and that persistent tyranny justifies resistance, these ideas helped shape the modern world. They're embedded in democratic constitutions, in international human rights law, and in the moral frameworks we use to evaluate political systems. But they also remain controversial and challenging. Even in established democracies, we continue to grapple with questions about when civil disobedience is justified, how to balance order and freedom, and what to do when democratic institutions themselves seem to fail. Locke's insights don't give us easy answers to these contemporary challenges, but they do give us a framework for thinking about them thoughtfully and seriously. John Locke's two treatises of government remains a foundational text in political philosophy, advocating for the principles of natural rights and the social contract. Locke challenges the idea of divine right monarchies and argues for a government that serves the people. His treatises emphasize that legitimacy in governance arises from the consent of the governed, and that individuals inherently possess rights to life, liberty, and property. Key takeaways. 1. The consent of the governed is paramount. Locke asserts that true political authority derives from the consent of the people. Practically, this means engaging actively in democratic processes, be it voting, advocacy, or public discourse, to ensure that governance reflects the will of the people. Start by participating in local community meetings to make your voice heard. 2. Natural rights are inviolable. The fundamental rights to life, liberty, and property are non-negotiable. Apply this by respecting these rights in others and advocating for policies that protect them. Begin by volunteering with organizations that focus on civil rights. 3. The right to revolution. Locke posits that when a government fails to protect its citizens' rights, the people have the right to overthrow it. While drastic, apply this mindset as a reminder of the power and responsibility of civic engagement. Start small by joining peaceful protests or writing to local representatives about issues that matter to you. 4. Property as a foundation of freedom. Property rights are central to Locke's philosophy, as they underpin personal freedom and economic stability. Practically, protect your own property rights and advocate for fair economic policies that allow others to do the same. Consider learning about local property laws and rights to better protect your interests. 5. Separation of powers. Emphasizing the need for checks and balances, Locke argues for a government structure that prevents any one branch from becoming too powerful. Support this by staying informed about governmental workings and demanding transparency and accountability. Start by regularly reading about current events and legislative changes. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.